A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Well, before we go to the Minsk business, let's keep in mind that everything that Secretary Hegseth has said has been said by the Russians for months. He's simply repeating back to the Russians what they've said. So that's fine. I happen to have agreed with that from the very beginning. When it comes to security guarantees, depends on how you interpret that. This is back to the idea of a larger security architecture, which is designed to prevent any further outbreak in the future. So I think we're getting closer and closer and closer to the point where the Russians will talk to us, because we're effectively repeating back to them what they've been saying for months, and they were always ignored by Biden. Now, as far as Minsk goes, remember that Minsk, as we now know, and Macron has said this as well, not just Mrs. Merkel, who was in the chancellorship at the time in Germany, was designed to buy time for this Ukrainian reactionary criminal state to build up an army and a force with which it could attack Russia. Now, that's what we mean when we don't want another Minsk round, because it was meaningless. There was no intention on the part of the West to ever implement anything. And the sad part is that ultimately between 2014 and the outbreak or the beginning of this intervention by the Russians in 2022, more than 14,000 Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk were killed by the incessant attacks by the Ukrainians. So I think, that's what we need to understand about Minsk. Minsk was a fraud, and it was perpetrated to confuse and mislead and beguile the Russians. So when he says no more Minsk, I think he's sending a signal, as is Donald Trump, we're not going to go down that road. I hope so, because one of the things that we've got to be certain of is that we tell the truth. You can lie in a domestic context, as most politicians do, about a lot of things. In international relations between great powers, you have to be absolutely truthful.
And on that regard, and especially talking about the Minsk and where this is going, I think we have to take a second to look at the negotiating hand, the leverage that Trump does and doesn't have in terms of what kind of an outcome he's going to get. And I think that, and I'd like your view on this, I think that history is going to be really ugly to the Biden administration, really to the West writ large, and that includes virtually all of NATO, heading back into the time before the invasion happened, going back into 2021, because obviously we had the Minsk agreements. At any time we could have compelled Ukraine to just abide by the terms that we helped negotiate, and there would almost certainly have never been a war. But then we systematically sabotaged every opportunity to either prevent the war right before it happened or any of a number of negotiating possibilities. We kept on sabotaging those, and we had Secretary of Defense Austin, who said, early in the war that our objective was to, quote, weaken Russia. Well, now then, the cost for that effort is probably, and I think you've said it a couple of times, and the evidence, I think, supports it, somewhere close to 1 million Ukrainian deaths so far, certainly the loss of a lot of territory, and yet we have a Russia that's not only not weakened, but now it's a lot stronger than it was. I wonder if you can talk about a little bit about how much stronger Russia is, because I think some still don't understand that.
Well, this is important to understand, that whenever I've been critical of President Trump on the question of what to do about Ukraine since he took office, I fully support the president on his domestic policies, and I think they're going in the right direction. He set a lot of positive forces in motion. Strongly support those. My concern has always been not to be distracted by events overseas, that if he could lose control here at home, because there are far more serious crises that are closer to us, and that's where he should focus. Now, having said that, I think we have to understand a couple of things. He came in and he adopted this false narrative that had been spun up over the previous years in London and Langley, and then repeated ad nauseum by the media, that we're all willing servants of this of this war. He's got to sweep that aside. He's got to get back to basics and go back to something that he did indicate a long time ago. This is not his. He did not start this. He did not want this. He said repeatedly it wouldn't have happened had he been there. Fine. But now he needs to make it very clear this is not his, and he wants to end it. Now, he doesn't have to get a quote-unquote win over the Russians. Believe me, if he ends this, he gets a win at home, here, with the American people. They don't want anything to do with this war with Russia, and certainly don't want the risk of any kind of nuclear conflagration. Absolutely not. So that's his win. The Europeans win because they're ultimately going to replace these terrible governments, these globalists that have sacrificed over 1 million Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russians to nothing for no purpose when it was completely unnecessary. They need to go away, and they need to be expelled and removed. Now, as far as whether or not NATO survives, I don't think it will. I think NATO is increasingly an empty facade, and it may be one of these things, well, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It may just quietly sink into the abyss and vanish. It's not meaningful. And frankly, at this point, from an American standpoint, that's fine. The United States doesn't need it. What we need is good relations with everybody in Europe, and we don't need to have to garrison the place to get those. So I think all of this is bound up with what President Trump is thinking, and I'm really glad to hear the things that Secretary Hegseth has said, because they are a breath of fresh air.
Indeed. In fact, also in that same conversation from Hegseth, he specifically talked about the potential future of NATO.
Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine.
Now, I think this is one where there may be a lot of other things meant inside of this about NATO itself, not just about Ukraine, because he's saying, hey, whatever's going to happen in Ukraine, you guys got to handle it. And you need to pick up a lot more of your the cost of NATO itself. Do you see this potentially as Trump laying the groundwork for we're going to continue to take a step back from NATO?
President Trump made it very clear to me and anybody else who cared to listen to him years ago that he thought the Europeans should be their own first responders. In other words, this reliance on U.S. forces to go thousands of miles from the continental United States into Europe to marshal air and naval power on a moment's notice to defend Europe was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from the threat standpoint because Russia doesn't present that kind of threat, nor is Russia interested in it. And he's tried repeatedly to persuade the Europeans they must be responsible for their own defense. I think what probably President Trump would like, and I'm sure Secretary Hegseth would probably be receptive to this, is that fine, if this NATO thing survives, that's great, but you've got to take the lead. And remember, all the times you and I have spoken, the op-eds I wrote saying over and over and over again, a European four-star should replace the American four-star. We've got to get out of the business of taking responsibility for the command and defense of the European theater. That's not our problem. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's really what Secretary Hegseth is saying. Let's get out of this. We'll backstop you. We will stand by you, in the event of a serious conflagration. We'll back you up. But you've got to take the lead and defend yourselves. I think that's very clear. I think that's what President Trump wants, and he should want it, and the Congress should want it. But we all know Congress will fight it because you're disrupting a money flow that's become very, very useful for a lot of people, only not the American people.
Now, let's go down that path for a minute, because I think it's really important. There are a number of voices, both in the United States and definitely in Europe, that are in near panic fear that Trump is going to, get us out of NATO, et cetera, as though that's going to be something that's going to put our national security at great risk or so. I wonder if you can discuss something, because to me, taking the emotion out of it and whatever financial obligations some people may have, or benefits rather, is that when you just look at the fundamentals, wait a minute, when we started NATO in 1949, Europe was still in rubble for the most part from World War II, and economies and militaries, et cetera. And there was a need for U.S., especially to face off against the Soviet threat. But now then you've got all these very, very wealthy countries. And why? What is your argument against the people who say that we should stay there literally forever, as opposed to saying, no, each of these nations should get back to the historical norm and provide for their own security? What is so bad about that?
Well, there's a vast difference between seeking to preserve the freedom and liberty of nations in the aftermath of a terrible war that did not fall under communist occupation, and staying somewhere in perpetuity on the grounds that if we leave, there may be disputes or conflicts. Well, I have a newsflash. There have been disputes and conflicts all over the world for thousands of years, long before we existed. There will be more conflicts and disputes after we're dead. In other words, once we leave, will there be a potential for disputes and conflicts? Yes. But the Europeans, certainly before the First World War, demonstrated pretty conclusively after the Napoleonic Wars that they could handle those things. I think we're living in a different age now. I don't see any interest in Germany, among any Germans, in invading France, or the French are not interested in fighting with the Italians or the Spaniards. I mean, this stuff's over with. Eastern Europe, there's some unfinished business, let's be frank. And that's going to come to the fore. Hungary lost a great deal in World War I, and even more after the Second World War. That's unfinished business. There's unfinished business for them in Ukraine. There's unfinished business with Poland in Ukraine. But these things are not our affair. And these things will have to be sorted out regionally. I think the world collectively, ever since the 1970s, has been moving towards greater regionalization, Dan. In other words, instead of seeing the global community as a community, we need to see the global population organized into regions with major powers in each of the region that operate as arbitrators and maintain peace, security, and build prosperity. This is something that was predicted by a man named Hedley Bull at Oxford, long before anybody wrote The Fourth Turning or Toffler's Waves or anything else. I think we're there. I think Europe will devolve to some extent into new regions, because the problem in NATO was always the same. The view of things from Berlin did not match the view from Madrid, and the view from Paris had nothing to do with the view from Stockholm or Athens. And that's more true now than ever. So I think you're going to see new security arrangements emerge, which is fine. They should, because they have a greater chance of succeeding than anything we impose. And right now, NATO is a legacy of our imposition, let's be frank.